Welcome back to One Boring Historian. Before we dive in, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? And what time of day is it for you? Drop it in the comments below. It's always amazing to see this little community connecting across different corners of the world. And if you enjoy these strange journeys into history, go ahead and like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more curious minds find us. Now, today, we're looking at one of the most baffling and unsettling mysteries of the past. Imagine stepping into the streets of your city and seeing your neighbors dancing uncontrollably, not for joy, but as if trapped, their bodies moving against their will, some dancing until their feet bled, and some until they died. This is the story of the dancing plague of 1518. Now let's begin and talk about Strasbourg. Not the city you might know today, with its picturesque canals and half-timbered charm. Let's go back 500 years, to the summer of 1518. I want you to try and feel it. Not just see it, but feel it. Because to understand what happened there, you have to understand the atmosphere. The sheer, crushing weight of it. It was a free imperial city then, a buzzing hub of trade on the Rhine. But in the summer of 1518, it felt less like a hub and more like a pressure cooker. The air didn't move. It sat. A thick, woolen blanket of heat that smothered everything. It was the kind of heat that made the very stones of the buildings seem to sweat. The smell, that's the first thing you'd notice. The smell of 20,000 people and their animals, all crammed behind protective walls. It was the smell of dust churned up by cartwheels, of baking horse dung from the streets, of wood smoke from 1,000 huts, and underneath it all, the faint, cloying sweetness of decay from the butchers rose down by the river. The sun was a merciless, white disk in a bleached-out sky. It beat down on the crowded, crooked alleys where the jettied upper floors of the timber-framed houses leaned so close they nearly touched, creating shadowy canyons that offered no relief. Only stagnant, suffocating air. This wasn't just a seasonal discomfort. It was the culmination of years of dread. The years leading up to 1518 had been brutal. Harvests had failed repeatedly. Cruel frosts in spring had nipped the vines in the bud. Torrential rains in summer had turned fields into quagmires, rotting the grain before it could be harvested. The price of a simple loaf of bread had soared to impossible heights. Famine didn't always mean people dropping dead in the streets. It meant a grinding, constant hunger, the slow weakening of the body, the dull ache in the belly that never quite went away. It made you tired. It made you cold. It made you see the world through a lens of deep-seated anxiety. And then there was the sickness. The English sweat, a mysterious, violent fever that could carry off a healthy man in a matter of hours, had been prowling the regions round Alsace for decades. It would appear without warning, burn through a town and vanish, leaving behind a legacy of terror. People lived with the low-grade, constant fear that the sweat, or the plague, or some other nameless pestilence, was just over the next hill. Life was fragile. God's favor seemed conditional, and his punishments were swift and terrible. This was the world of Frau Troffea, a name. That's all history has really given us, a name. We don't know if she was young or old, rich or poor, but we can imagine. Let's imagine she was a housewife, living in a modest dwelling on a narrow, unassuming lane known as the Klein Metzgrow, not far from the city's horse market. Her life was one of unending labor, fetching water from the public well, queuing for what little bread was available, trying to stretch a thin stew to feed her family. The heat in her small home would have been unbearable, the air thick with the smell of cooking and humanity. She, like everyone else in Strasbourg, was tired. She was hungry. Her nerves, like the city's, were worn thin. She was a thread in a social fabric that was straining, fraying, ready to snap. And then, one day in mid-July, she took a step. And then another. And then she just kept going. It didn't start with a scream. There was no fanfare. She simply stepped out of her door, perhaps onto the dusty, uneven cobbles of her street. And she began to dance. I need you to erase any modern conception of dance from your mind. This wasn't celebration. This wasn't joy. This was a pathology, a compulsion. Her movements were jerky, rhythmic, a frantic and desperate jig entirely divorced from music. There was no music. The only soundtrack was the harsh, slapping sound of her shoes on the stone and the ragged, gasping soar of her own breath. Her face. This is the detail that chills. It wasn't a face lost in ecstasy. It was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Her eyes were wide, staring at something only she could see. Some private horror unfolding in the empty air before her. She was trapped inside a body that was no longer her own. A crowd gathered. Of course, first, a few children, who pointed and giggled until a sharp word from a parent shut them up. Then neighbors emerged from their workshops and homes. Their faces showed confusion first, then a dawning. Deep unease. This was wrong. This was profoundly not right. Imagine a neighbor, leaning close to her husband in the doorway. Her voice a low whisper. Hans, what is she doing? Has the heat taken her mind? Someone, perhaps a brave or foolish man, tried to intervene. He called her name, Frau Troffea. He reached out, tried to grab her shoulders, to hold her still, to break the spell. She reacted with a feral violence, shrieking a roar. Animal sound that cut through the murmur of the crowd and fought him off with a strength that seemed impossible. The man stumbled back, shocked. The mood in the street shifted instantly. Whatever this was, it wasn't simple madness. It was something stronger, something darker. She danced for an hour. Then, too, the sun climbed higher. Her simple dress was soon soaked through with sweat, clinging to her body. You could see the raw, angry blisters rising on her feet, the strain in every tendon of her neck. She was crying, but the tears were lost in the sweat. She was begging, between those terrible, ragged gasps, for it to stop. But her body would not obey. Where was her husband? History is silent, but we can imagine him, summoned from his workshop, pushing through the crowd, his face a storm of confusion, embarrassment, and then, finally, a helpless, terrifying fear. What does a man do in 1518 when his wife is clearly possessed by something he cannot understand? He can't reason with it. He can't fight it. All he can do is watch his world disintegrate in front of him. Eventually, authority arrived, a city magistrate, summoned by a panicked neighbor. This man was used to settling market disputes and dealing with the occasional drunk. He was not prepared for Frau Troffea. He watched for a long minute, his face a mixture of professional duty and superstitious dread. To his early modern mind, educated but steeped in a world of spirits and science, this didn't look like a medical condition. It looked like possession. It looked like a curse. It looked, frankly, like the work of the devil. He didn't send for a physician. His solution was spiritual. He ordered his men to seize her difficult task with her flailing limbs and manhandle her into a cart. She was still twitching, her feet still performing their awful, stepping dance even as the cart rolled away, out through the city gates. She was to be taken to the shrine of St. Vitus in the Vosges mountains. Saint Vitus, the patron saint of dancers and epileptics. The logic, in its own way, was perfect. The street fell quiet. The bizarre performance was over. The neighbors dispersed, shaking their heads. It was a story to tell over a meager supper. A strange, unsettling anecdote. They closed their shutters that night, perhaps holding their families a little tighter. They thought, they hoped, that was the end of it. A singular oddity, a strange affliction that had been taken away. The air, however, still felt heavy. The heat did not break, and the memory of Frau Troffea's terrified eyes, and the sound of her scraping, slapping feet, lingered in the stagnant air. It was a seed, and it had been planted in the fertile soil of a city already ripe for despair. The silence that followed Frau Troffea's removal was a fragile thing. It was the silence of a held breath. For a day, perhaps two, the city of Strasbourg tried to convince itself it had been a singular event. A strange fever, a passing madness. The heat, perhaps. People went about their business, but the atmosphere had shifted. It was charged now, like the air before a lightning strike. Conversations were hushed. Glances towards the end of the Klein Metzgrow were furtive, quick. The story was told and retold, each time acquiring new, more terrifying details. She had been foaming at the mouth. She had spoken in tongues. She had cursed the name of God. The tale was no longer just about a woman. It was a seed of collective anxiety, and it was germinating quickly in the feverish heat. It broke again, not with a shout, but with a whimper. This time, it was a young maid. Her name is lost to us. Let's call her Elsa. She was 15, perhaps. Sent to draw water from the public well on the Fischmarkt. The well was a social hub, a place of gossip and chatter. But that day, the chatter was about Frau Troffea. Elsa was listening, her bucket halfway down the stone shaft, her knuckles white on the rope. She was imagining it. The frantic dancing, the terror, and as she pulled the heavy bucket back up, hand over hand, she felt a peculiar sensation, a tingling in her legs, a tightness in her calves. She hauled the bucket over the lip of the well, water sloshing over the edge onto her feet. And then she let go of the rope. She didn't scream. She just took a small, awkward step to the side, then another. Then her body gave a sudden, violent jerk, and the dance began. It was the same pattern, the same jerky, rhythmic, desperate movements, the same mask of terror frozen on a young girl's face. The women at the well fell silent. Their hands flew to their mouths. One of them dropped her own bucket. The sound a loud, hollow clatter in the sudden quiet. The contagion was no longer an abstract story. It was here. It was now. It was happening to little Elsa, whom they all knew. The news did not travel. It ignited. It was a spark landing on tinder-dry kindling. Within hours, another case was reported. A baker's wife, kneading dough, suddenly found her hands stilled but her feet moving, carrying her in a stumbling, lurching circle round the warm bakery until she collapsed through the doorway and into the street. Then a blacksmith's apprentice, a boy with arms already thick with muscle, dropped his hammer with a clang and began to jerk and stomp outside the forge, his powerful frame making the dance look even more violent and unnatural. This was the true horror of it. The mode of transmission. It wasn't spreading through bad air or physical touch. It was spreading through sight, through sound, through the sheer, unbearable power of suggestion. It was a contagion of the mind. You would see your neighbor, your friend, your child, seized by this awful, incomprehensible fate. You would watch a morbid fascination warring with your gut-churning fear. You would see the sweat, hear the ragged, sobbing breaths. See the raw blisters on their feet, and then you would feel it a cold dread sluicing through your veins, a thought, unbidden and terrifying. What if I am next? And for some, that thought became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The body, primed by fear and hunger and the collective panic, would simply obey. It would snap. The soundscape of the city began to change. The familiar, comforting sounds of urban life, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the calls of the fishmongers, the gossip of housewives were slowly, inexorably being drowned out, replaced by a new, chilling chorus, the slap, slap, slap of bare feet on hot cobblestones, the harsh, rhythmic gasping of lungs pushed far beyond their limits, the occasional, blood-curdling scream of a new victim realizing their body was no longer their own. And underpinning it all, the low, constant murmur of a terrified populace, is sound like the buzzing of a disturbed beehive. Panic is a physical thing. You can smell it. In Strasbourg that July, the smell of fear began to mix with the smell of dust and decay. It was the smell of cold sweat on hot skin. The city's pulse was racing. You could see it in the way people moved through the streets quickly, with their heads down, avoiding eye contact. You could see it in the way mothers now clutched their children's hands, not to guide them, but to yank them away from any open space where someone might be dancing. You could see it in the way neighbors looked at each other, not with familiarity, but with a new, furtive suspicion. Is there a strange light in your eyes? Is that a twitch in your hand? Are you about to break? The social contract, the fragile trust that holds a community together, was beginning to dissolve. The city council could no longer pretend. The problem hadn't been carted away with Frau Troffea. It was multiplying. These were practical men. Merchants, lawyers, guildmasters. Their world was one of ledgers, laws, and tariffs. They were equipped to handle a trade dispute with Mainz, not a supernatural epidemic. Their meetings in the chamber of the fowls, the city hall, were fraught. The windows were open, but no breeze came in, only the distant, unsettling sounds of a city coming undone. They had to be seen to do something. So they did what people in power do when faced with the inexplicable. They consulted the experts. They summoned the physicians. Now, understand the state of medicine in 1518. It was not a science. It was a philosophy, based on the writings of a man who had been dead for over 1,000 years. The physicians arrived, men of learning and gravity in their long robes. They listened to the descriptions. They consulted their leather-bound volumes of Galen and of Avicenna, and they delivered their diagnosis. It was, to them, perfectly obvious. The body, they explained, was governed by four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Health was balance, sickness was imbalance. The patients were sweating, red-faced, their hearts racing. This was a clear case of sanguine excess, an overabundance of hot blood. The intense summer heat had literally overheated the blood, which had risen to the brain, cooking it inside the skull, causing the madness and the uncontrollable movements. And the cure for an excess of hot blood: you needed to purge it. You needed to burn it off. You needed to dance it out. Let me repeat that, the learned, esteemed physicians of Strasbourg concluded that the way to stop people from dancing themselves to death was to make them dance more. They advised that the afflicted must be allowed to dance themselves into a state of complete exhaustion, to burn the cropped humours out of their systems. It was a purge, a violent, final catharsis. The city council, desperate for any plan, any action that resembled control, latched onto this theory. It was logical, in its own terrifying way. It was a known quantity from ancient authorities. So They made a decision. A decree was issued. It stands as one of the most catastrophically misguided municipal orders in history. They commanded that the main public squares, the Cornmarkt, the horse market, be cleared of all obstacles. They commissioned the immediate construction of a large wooden stage. Think of the surreal bureaucracy of that. The requisition orders for timber, the hiring of carpenters, their hammers ringing out not to build homes or barns, but a platform from mass suffering. The stage was a pragmatic choice. They believed the dancers would be less likely to injure themselves on planks than on hard cobblestones, but they didn't stop there. If the dancers needed to dance, they reasoned, they should have the proper facilities, they should have music. So they hired musicians, pipers, drummers, lute players. They were recruited from the city's guilds and from neighboring towns, paid from the city treasury. Furthermore, they hired strong men porters, laborers, carters, and gave them a horrifying, surreal job description. Their task was to hold the dancers upright, to keep them moving when their own strength failed them. Now, I want you to truly picture this scene, because it is an image of hell, crafted not by demons, but by well-intentioned, terrified men. In the center of Strasbourg, under the blistering July sun, a new wooden stage stands on it. Dozens, then 100, then more people are convulsing. This is not dancing, it is violent. Involuntary spasm, a grotesque parody of motion. Their feet are bloody ruins. The skin has been worn away entirely, leaving a pulpy, raw mess that leaves dark, sticky smears on the fresh sawn wood with every step. Their clothing is torn and soaked with sweat. Their hair is matted. Their eyes are wild and seeing. And right beside the stage, there are musicians. These are not merry minstrels. These are terrified men. Their faces are pale, their hands shaking as they try to maintain a relentless, driving rhythm. They are playing jigs, reels, lively tunes, a horrifyingly cheerful soundtrack to a scene of utter agony. They are being paid to feed the madness. When a piper's breath falters or a drummer's arm tires, a city official is there to urge them on. Their music is a weapon against the silence, a futile attempt to impose order on the chaos. And when a dancer finally collapses, lungs burning, muscles shredded, consciousness fading, the strong men move in. They are not healers, they are stagehands in this theater of the damned. They grab the fallen under their arms, their faces set in grim, disbelieving lines. They hold them back to their feet. They force their limp, broken bodies to keep moving. They force them to dance. Some dance until their ribs crack from the exertion. Some dance until they suffer a stroke. Their bodies go limp in a new, more final way. Some simply dance until their hearts give out, and they die, right there on the stage, and are dragged off by the ankles to make room for the next victim. This is not a cure. It is state-sanctioned torture, a public dance macabre. And the worst part, the part that truly unmoored the city, was the sound. That music, that terrible, manic, relentless music. It didn't stop. It started at dawn and it went deep into the night. It was the soundtrack to the city's nightmare. You could hear it everywhere, in your home, in your workshop. You were trying to eat a thin soup, to comfort your children, to say your prayers, but that rhythm was always there in the background, a constant, maddening reminder that just a few streets away, your fellow human beings were being danced to death on the orders of the city fathers, the very authorities meant to protect them were orchestrating their destruction. The stage in the Cornmarkt became a dark sun, a gravitational center of horror around which the entire city now orbited. Fear had become the only currency. Trust was a forgotten luxury. Everyone was a potential victim. Everyone was a potential carrier of the invisible madness, and on the stage, under the blistering sun, the piper played on. As the macabre spectacle in the corn-marked ground on, a parallel response was unfolding, while the city council and the physicians dealt with the body, or rather, attempted to dance it into submission a great many of Strasbourg's citizens, and indeed many of its leaders, believed they were witnessing something that no amount of bloodletting or frantic jigs could ever hope to cure. This was not an imbalance of humours. This was an imbalance of the soul. The body was merely the battleground. The real war was being waged in the spiritual realm, and it required spiritual weapons. The most immediate and visceral of these responses came from the pulpit. From the high altar of the cathedral to the small, cramped pulpits of parish churches, the clergy addressed a terrified, captive audience. Their sermons were not gentle homilies. They were full-throated, fire and brimstone pronouncements that shook the very timbers of the churches. Imagine the scene. The air inside is thick, still, and heavy with the smell of beeswax, old stone, and the sweat of a packed congregation. The people are not looking at each other. Their eyes are fixed on the priest, a dark figure against the gleam of gold leaf and candlelight. His voice starts low, a rumble of distant thunder. You see them, do you not? He intones, his voice rising. You see them dance. They do not dance to a piper's tune, but to the tune of God's wrath. Their limbs are not their own, but are pulled by the strings of divine displeasure. He would lean forward, his face a mask of righteous fury, pointing a trembling finger out towards the city, towards the sound of the distant music. We have grown fat and comfortable in our sin. We have forgotten the laws of the Lord. We have traded piety for a profit, and prayer for a pleasure. We have allowed vanity and greed to fester in our hearts. And now, he sends his warning. He has taken the bodies of these poor wretches and made them a spectacle. A living memento mori for us all. The congregation would shift, a ripple of unease and guilt passing through them. This rhetoric was powerful because it made a terrifying kind of sense. It provided a reason. It was no longer a random, senseless tragedy. It was a punishment, a correction, a dreadful, but purposeful, act from a wrathful God. The priest's voice would reach a crescendo. Look upon them and see the fate of the unrepentant soul eternal, agonizing, unresting motion in the fires of hell. This is not a sickness of the body, but a sickness of the soul. The only cure is not the physician's lance, but the lance of contrition piercing your hearts. Not an apothecary's potion, but the bitter draught of repentance. Fall to your knees. Beg for forgiveness, lest he seize you next and make you dance before the altar of his judgment, and the people would fall. They would kneel on the cold stone floor, weeping, praying, striking their breasts. The fear was no longer amorphous. It was directed. It had a target, their own sinfulness. The solution was clear, mass penance. This led to the organization of processions. These were not celebratory affairs. They were grim, solemn marches of atonement. The city's most sacred relics were brought out from their cases and shrines, the bones of saints, fragments of the true cross. A thorn from the crown of thorns, these were placed on ornate biers and carried through the streets by the highest clergy, dressed in their most splendid vestments. They were followed by a river of citizens, thousands strong, walking barefoot on the hot cobbles, many engaged in public flagellation, whipping their own backs with knotted cords until the blood ran down their robes, their pain a sympathetic offering to ward off a greater, spiritual pain. They chanted litanies, their voices a low, desperate drone that competed with the manic music from the corn-mart. The processions would often deliberately route past the stage. The contrast was real, almost blasphemous. On one side, a scene of enforced, horrific celebration. On the other, a scene of utter, self-inflicted misery. The flagellants would weep and pray as they passed the dancers, who screamed and gasped in their own private hells. The two responses, the civic and the religious, existed in parallel, each accusing the other of folly, both failing utterly. For individual cases, the Church had a more targeted and more terrifying solution: exorcism. This was not the dramatic spectacle of modern cinema. It was a solemn, deadly serious, and profoundly frightening ritual. A priest would be summoned to the home of an afflicted person. The room would be cleared of all but the essential family members. The air would be thick with the smell of fear and sickness. The priest, clad in a stole, would begin. He would sprinkle holy water in the corners of the room, tracing the sign of the cross. He would hold a crucifix before the twitching, dancing victim. In nomen patris, et filii, et spiritus sancti, he would begin, his voice low and steady. Exorcizo te, immundissim spiritus. I exorcise you, most unclean spirit. The language was archaic, powerful. He would command the demon to name itself, to reveal its nature. The responses, when they came, were what truly chilled the blood. The afflicted person, their voice often distorted into a guttural growl or a high-pitched shriek, would sometimes answer. They would claim to be legion. They would curse the name of Christ. They would recoil as if burned when the priest pressed a relic, perhaps a finger bone of Saint Aurelia, one of the city's patron saints, to their forehead. When the local clergy and the local relics proved ineffective, the people, in their desperation, looked further afield. They turned to the specific saint associated with such afflictions, St. Vitus. The cult of Saint Vitus was a complex and strangely appropriate one. He was a Sicilian child martyr, killed during the persecutions of Diocletian over the centuries. He had become the patron saint of actors, dancers, and epileptics, a telling combination that reveals the medieval mind's connection between involuntary movement, performance, and divine or demonic intervention. The logic was a terrifying paradox. Saint Vitus could both cause the dancing madness as a punishment for irreverence, and he could cure it if properly appeased. The prescribed method of appeasement was pilgrimage, and so the most desperate families began to organize journeys. The most famous shrine was at Corvian, Saxony, but closer shrines in the Vosges Mountains or the Black Forest also claimed relics: a finger bone, a tooth, a lock of hair. The pilgrimages were spectacles of profound pathos. The afflicted were often tied to carts or litters, their bodies still convulsing, their limbs still jerking to the silent, awful music in their heads. They were accompanied by family members, husbands, wives, parents, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and utter exhaustion. Priests often led the way, chanting psalms to ward off evil spirits along the road. They would move in a lurching, stop-start progression across the countryside. Villagers in the towns they passed through would line the roads. Some would throw herbs or offer sips of water in a gesture of pity. Others would make the sign of the cross and slam their shutters closed, afraid the curse was airborne, that the mere sight of these living damned could pass the affliction to them. The shrines themselves were usually small, dark chapels, lit by countless votive candles that filled the air with the smell of tallow and smoke. The relic would be brought forth, encased in glass and gold, and the pilgrims would be urged to touch the case, to press their foreheads against it, to pray with a fervor born of absolute desperation. Mass would be celebrated, the Eucharist offered as the ultimate spiritual medicine. For a handful, the combination of the journey, the intense psychological focus on a cure, the change of scene, and the sheer power of suggestion may have brought a respite. They would return home claiming a miracle. their recovery bolstering the saint's reputation and fueling the cult. But for many, many others, the compulsion remained, undiminished by mountain air or sacred bones. They would make the long, agonizing journey back to Strasbourg, their faith shattered, their bodies broken, their hope extinguished. They returned to a city that had no place for them anymore, except perhaps back on the bloody stage in the Cormarkt. This was the great clash. The physicians saw an excess of blood. The clergy saw an excess of sin. The common folk saw malicious spirits or a saint's curse. Each worldview prescribed its own brutal remedy. More dancing, more penance, more pilgrimage, and caught in the middle, the victims themselves, their suffering was not alleviated. It was merely interpreted, argued over, and used as evidence in a theological and medical debate. Their bodies were the parchment upon which the fears of an entire age were being written, in blood and sweat and tears. The remedies of heaven, it seemed, were just as futile as the remedies of earth. To truly understand the terror that gripped the Strasbourg City Council in the summer of 1518, we must understand that they were not facing an unknown monster. They were facing a ghost, a spectre that had haunted the Rhineland, and indeed all of Europe, for generations. The horror in their eyes was not just for the suffering in their streets. It was the dread of recognition. They had heard these stories before. The story of Strasbourg was not the first chapter. It was merely the most detailed, the most documented echo of a much older, much deeper nightmare. The nightmare began, or at least was first meticulously recorded, in the year 1374. In the city of Aachen, the world of 1374 was a world still gasping from the aftershocks of the Black Death. A generation prior, the plague had swept through Europe, carrying off perhaps a third of the entire population. The social, economic, and psychological fabric of the continent had been torn apart. The world felt unstable, contingent, as if God's favor had been permanently withdrawn, leaving humanity exposed to every passing malady and demonic whim. It was in this atmosphere of profound, existential dread that the first major dancing plague erupted. It began, as it would in Strasbourg. In the high summer, the chronicles describe strange weather, spring of flooding rains giving way to an unnaturally still and humid heat. The air felt charged, thick with the smell of wet stone and rotting crops, heavy with a sense of impending revelation or calamity. And then, the first dancers appeared, not one or two, but dozens, then hundreds. Seemingly all at once, they flooded into the streets round the great cathedral, their bodies contorting in a violent, uncontrolled frenzy. The descriptions from medieval chroniclers are chillingly consistent. The Aachen dancers did not laugh or smile. They screamed of visions, of seeing the heavens open to reveal a furious Christ, judging them, of falling into fiery pits, of being pursued and tormented by demons with red-hot pincers and branding irons. They cried out to onlookers, begging for help, for someone to stop them, even as their own bodies betrayed them. They spoke of a terrible, burning heat within their veins, an internal fire that could only be momentarily banked by the constant, violent motion. They were not dancing for anything. They were dancing from something, from the horrors their own minds were showing them. A monk from a nearby monastery, one of the few literate witnesses, described the scene in a letter that survives in fragments. They came in multitudes from the Low Countries, both men and women, and they danced and leaped in the public roads and in the churches themselves. Nor could they refrain themselves. They were seen to leap and dance, after the manner of those possessed by devils, foaming at the mouth with their eyes wild and unseeing, and they cried out upon the name of God and his saints. But whether in supplication or in blasphemy, none could tell. They continued in this fashion for many hours, until they fell down as if dead, their strength entirely spent, and some did not rise. Again, the authorities in Aachen, the city council, the clergy were as baffled as their counterparts in Strasbourg would be. The physicians, applying the same Galenic principles, were useless. The clergy saw demonic possession. They performed public exorcisms, swinging censers that filled the air with the sweet, cloying smell of incense, chanting Latin rites, holding aloft relics and holy water. When this failed, they concluded it was a divine punishment. Processions were ordered. Every sacred icon was paraded through the thronging, convulsing streets. The entire population was commanded to prayer and penance. But the dancing continued further. Citizens of Aachen, the world had been utterly inverted. The familiar streets of their home had become a stage for a pageant of hell. Then, as mysteriously as it had begun, the plague in Aachen subsided. But it did not vanish. It travelled, like a malevolent spirit riding the currents of the Rhine. The dancing mania spread. It was a contagion of the mind, leaping from city to city, carried by rumour, panic, and the terrified reports of travellers. It was not a disease of the body, but a disease of information, and it spread with a terrifying speed. It moved into the Low Countries, striking cities like Utrecht and Leuven in Utrecht. A chronicler notes that the dancers would often tear their clothing off, screaming that they were burning up, adding a new layer of horror and shame to the spectacle. Then it moved south to Metz. The Metz outbreak is particularly noted for its scale. Thousands were said to be afflicted. The mania so vast it overwhelmed the city's capacity to respond. The authorities there, perhaps learning nothing from Aachen's failures, also attempted to facilitate the dancing, constructing platforms and providing musicians with the same catastrophic results. From Metz, the wave of hysteria lapped further into the Alsace region, the very heartland that would later host the Strasbourg outbreak. It touched Basel. It reached Liege in each new location. The pattern repeated itself with a dreadful, ritualistic consistency. It would begin with a handful of individuals, often women, often from the poorer, more superstitious quarters. Their frantic dancing would act as a catalyst, a psychic spark that ignited the latent fear in all who witnessed it. Panic would spread faster than the disease itself. The local authorities would respond with the same mixture of misguided medicine and desperate prayer. The mania would burn through the population for weeks or months, leaving a trail of physical wreckage and a far deeper scar of psychological terror in its wake. Before moving on, the accounts from these cities are a chorus of horror, each adding its own verse. A town clerk in Liege wrote of victims who claimed to see rivers of blood flowing through the streets, a vision no doubt colored by the recent memory of the plague in Zurich, and none was recorded as having danced for 3 days straight within the confines of her convent before collapsing and dying, her sisters unable to calm her, their prayers seeming only to intensify her frenzy. The hallucinations were a constant feature. They were not random. They were deeply rooted in the apocalyptic anxieties of the time. People didn't hallucinate butterflies or pleasant fields. They hallucinated the stuff of sermons and doom-laden prophecies, demons, hellfire, the wrathful face of God. A woman in Metz was said to have screamed that she was dancing on the thin crust of the world, and beneath her feet she could see the damned writhing in the fires of hell, and that if she stopped dancing, the crust would break and she would fall in. This was the psychological engine of the mania, the absolute, terrified conviction that to stop moving was to die, or worse, to be damned for eternity. The dancing was a frantic, desperate attempt to outrun divine judgment. These outbreaks occurred in 1374. The subsequent waves along the Rhine were not forgotten. They became embedded in the cultural memory of the region. They were the stuff of fireside tales and fire and brimstone sermons grandmothers would warn fidgety children to behave lest St. Vitus make them dance until they died. Preachers would use the stories as vivid, unforgettable illustrations of God's wrath upon a sinful people. The mania was a sleeping dragon, a recognized, if rare, catastrophe that every community knew could awaken at any time. So, when the first hushed reports trickled out of the Klein Metzgrow in July 1518 that a woman had begun to dance, the city's elders didn't see an isolated medical oddity. They saw the return of the dragon, their memories, and the memories enshrined in the city's own archives and the oral histories of their grandparents, screamed a single, terrifying word, recurrence. The horror in their eyes was not just for the suffering of one woman. It was the dread of what they knew, from the old stories, was likely to follow. Their desperate, catastrophic response to build a stage and hire musicians was born of this deep-seated historical trauma. They were not inventing a cure. They were attempting to apply a folk remedy, a piece of received wisdom that had somehow survived. The centuries, they were trying to expedite a process they believed was inevitable. They were following a script written by the ghosts of Aachen. But the 16th century was a different world from the 14th. The fear was the same, but the context had shifted dangerously. The initial wave of mania in 1374 had occurred in the immediate, numbing aftermath of the Black Death, a time of such universal catastrophe that the dancing plague was just one more horror in a world that had already ended. By 1518, Europe was a tinderbox of new anxieties. The teachings of Martin Luther were beginning to challenge the very foundations of the Catholic Church, creating profound religious instability. Famine had been constant, weakening bodies and minds. The people of Strasbourg were not just afraid of a dancing plague. They were already living in a state of heightened existential fear. The outbreak acted as a lightning rod for all these anxieties, and this time, they weren't just dealing with a medieval horror. They were dealing with a medieval horror and with the nascent tools of the modern world, including a printing press that would ensure their failure was broadcast, sensationalized, and remembered forever. The ghosts of Aachen had returned, and they had learned new tricks. In the midst of the chaos, the bloodied stages, the frantic processions, and the failed exorcisms, there was one name on everyone's lips, whispered with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. It wasn't the name of a physician or a city councillor. It was the name of a long-dead Sicilian teenager, St. Vitus. To understand the response to the dancing plague, one must understand the complex, paradoxical, and deeply powerful cult that had grown round this saint. He was not merely a figure of veneration. He was a key that unlocked the 16th century mind's understanding of the affliction. He was both the cause of the curse and the source of its cure. The historical Vitus was a child of nobility, martyred in the early 4th century during the persecutions of Diocletian. His legend, like that of many early saints, was a gruesome tapestry of faith and torture. He was said to have been thrown into a cauldron of boiling oil or pitch, yet emerged unscathed. He was accompanied by a rooster, a symbol of vigilance. But how did this Sicilian martyr become the patron saint of dancers and epileptics, the central figure in a Rhineland horror story? The connections are murky, layered over centuries by folk belief and linguistic coincidence, the term for the dancing mania, used by physicians and common folk alike. Was Choria Sancti Vitae St. Vitus's dance? The word choria comes from the Greek for dance. Some believe the connection rose because the saint's feast day, June 15th, fell within the period of the summer solstice, a time of ancient pre-Christian dancing rites that the Church sought to suppress and redirect. The uncontrollable movements of the afflicted also resembled the symptoms of Sydenham's chorea, a neurological disorder linked to rheumatic fever. But for the people of Strasbourg, the connection was not medical or historical. It was literal and supernatural. Saint Vitus was a touchy, volatile saint. It was believed that those who angered him by working on his feast day, by cursing his name, by failing to observe his rites with proper reverence, could be struck down by the dancing madness. As a punishment, he was the divine prankster who could condemn you to dance yourself to death for a moment of irreverence. This belief transformed the saint from a distant holy figure into an immediate, capricious, and terrifying presence in daily life. The fear of his curse was a powerful tool of social control. Mothers would warn their children, "Be good," or St. Vitus will make you dance. It was a threat as real and tangible as the threat of a whipping. The saint's name was woven into the very fabric of superstition. To dream of dancing was considered a dire omen, a warning from the saint himself. A sudden, unexplained muscle twitch could send a person into a spiral of anxiety, wondering if they had inadvertently offended him, and the dancing plague was its first, subtle symptom. But this was only one side of the coin. The same saint who could inflict the curse was also the only one who could lift it. This is the central paradox of the cult. For every story of his wrath, there was a story of his mercy. If you venerated him properly, if you showed him the respect he demanded, he could intercede with God to cure you. This created a vast, intricate economy of spiritual negotiation centered around his figure. The primary currency in this economy was the pilgrimage. The most famous shrine was at Corvey in Saxony. But dozens of other churches and monasteries across the Holy Roman Empire claimed to possess a relic of the Saint-Finger bone, a tooth, a vial of his blood, a piece of his tunic. These relics were the nuclear cores of spiritual power, housed in incredible works of art, bejeweled, gilded reliquaries shaped like arms, heads, or simple ornate caskets for a family with an afflicted member. The pilgrimage was a desperate, last-ditch effort. The journeys were epic tales of suffering in themselves. Imagine the procession, the afflicted person, often tied to a cart or a litter to prevent them from dancing themselves into a ditch, their body never still, a constant, jerking reminder of the purpose of the journey. They were accompanied by exhausted family members, their faces hollow with lack of sleep and fear. Often, a local priest would lead the way, chanting psalms of protection, Deus in adiatorium meum intend, O God, come to my assistance, his voice a steady drone against the irregular gasps and moans of the sufferer. They would travel for days, sometimes weeks. The sight of these pitiful caravans became a common and terrifying one on the roads of the Rhineland. A chronicler from Trier, watching one such group pass in the mid-1400s, wrote, "They came from the north, a score of them, led by two brothers who chanted ceaselessly to keep the demons at bay. The afflicted did not walk like normal men. They hopped and jigged, their bodies writhing as if snakes coiled beneath their skin. Their faces were not their own, twisted into masks of an agony so profound it seemed to border on a kind of ecstasy, which was more frightening still. They wore themselves to the bone upon the road, and when they could dance no more, their companions would carry them upon litters, their limbs still twitching and jerking in a terrible mockery of life. The people of the town crossed themselves and barred their doors, for it was said the sight of them alone could pass the curse to a healthy soul. Upon reaching the shrine, the final ritual would begin. The chapel would be dark, the air thick with the smoke of hundreds of votive candles, each one representing a prayer, a bargain, a hope. The relic would be brought forth and veiled with solemn ceremony. The pilgrims would approach, often on their knees. They would touch their foreheads to the cold glass of the reliquary, press their trembling hands against it, praying not with quiet devotion, but with raw, desperate supplication. Mass would be said, the Eucharist the body of Christ, would be offered as the ultimate spiritual medicine, a direct counter to the corruption of the body by the saint's curse for some. The combination of the journey, the profound psychological impact of the ritual, the power of suggestion, and perhaps simple exhaustion, did indeed bring relief. They would return home cured, their recovery hailed as a miracle, a story that would be told and retold, further cementing the saint's potent and fearsome reputation. These successful pilgrimages were the bedrock of the cult's semblance, but the veneration of St. Vitus wasn't only for times of crisis. It was woven into the annual rhythm of life. On his feast day, June 15th, towns and villages across the region would hold processions. His statue would be paraded through the streets, accompanied by priests, local dignitaries, and the entire populace. These were not joyous festivals. They were acts of communal propitiation. They were a way of saying, "See, Vitus, we honor you, we remember you, please, do not curse us." The dancing that sometimes occurred at these festivals was tense, careful. A performance walked on a knife's edge between celebration and invocation. There were songs. Not the manic jigs of the pipers in the cornmarket, but mournful, haunting ballads that told the story of the saint's power. These songs, passed down orally, were a key part of the folk memory. One might have told the story of a lazy farmer who ploughed his field on St. Vitus's day and was struck down by the dance, only to be saved when his wife made a pilgrimage to Corvey. They were moral fables set to music, reinforcing the rules of engagement with the saint, reverence and fear, in equal measure. In the end, the cult of St. Vitus provided something that the physicians and the city council could not, a framework, however terrifying. It offered an explanation and a solution. The dancing plague was no longer a random, senseless event. It was a transaction within a moral universe. You sinned against the saint. You were punished. You appeased the saint. You were saved. This was a logic that everyone, from the illiterate peasant to the educated consular, could understand. It was a story, and in the face of an unimaginable horror, a story, even a terrifying one, is sometimes the only comfort people have. The stage in the cornmarket was a testament to a failure. Earthly medicine, the road to the shrine of St. Vitus, was a testament to the enduring, desperate power of a heavenly story. While the clergy fought for souls and the city council built its stage, another battle was being waged against the dancing plague. This was the battle for the body itself, fought not with prayers and processions, but with knives, herbs, and a deeply intricate and utterly wrong understanding of how the human body worked. To step into a sick room in Strasbourg during the summer of 1518 was to step into a world where science and superstition were indistinguishable, where every remedy was a gamble, and where the cure was often as terrifying as the disease. The foundation of all medical thought was humoral theory, a system devised by the ancient Greek physician Galen and preserved, like a fly in amber, for over 1,000 years. The body, according to this theory, was a delicate ecosystem governed by vital fluids, or humus, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was eucrasia or perfect. Balanced mixture of these four. Disease was dyscrasia and imbalance. Every ailment, from a cough to a cancer, was diagnosed as an excess or a deficiency of one of these humours. The physician's job was not to fight germs or viruses, a concept centuries in the future, but to restore the balance. It was an elegant, comprehensive, and completely incorrect system, and it was about to be applied to the dancing plague. The physicians of Strasbourg, educated men who consulted leather-bound volumes of Galen and of Avicenna, observed the dancers. They saw the symptoms, the flushed, red faces, the frantic pulse, the profuse sweating, the sheer, overheated energy, their diagnosis was immediate and, to them, obvious, sanguine excess and overabundance of hot, moist blood. The intense summer heat had literally overheated the blood, which had risen to the brain, cooking it inside the skull, causing the hallucinations, the frenzy, and the uncontrollable motor impulses. The treatment, therefore, was to cool the patient and purge the excess humor. This diagnosis is what justified the city. Counselor's most catastrophic decision, the stage and the musicians. The logic was perverse but internally consistent. The body must be driven to the point of complete exhaustion to burn away the corrupt, overheated blood. But this was just the most public and dramatic application of their theory. In the privacy of homes, a more traditional and equally brutal medical response was underway. The foremost tool in the physician's arsenal was bloodletting. This was not a casual practice. It was a precise science based on the patient's age, temperament, the season, and the phase of the moon. A physician, or more often a barber surgeon, the period-esque combination of haircutter and medical practitioner, would be summoned to the home of an afflicted person. The scene would be one of quiet horror. The dancer would often be held down by family members, their limbs still jerking involuntarily. The surgeon would take out his lance at a sharp, flat, double-edged blade. He might sterilize it in a candle flame. A gesture towards cleanliness that did nothing to address the fundamental flaw of the procedure. A tourniquet would be tied tightly around the patient's upper arm, making the veins below stand out like blue cords against pale, sweat-sheen skin. The surgeon would select a vein, often the median cephalic. With a quick, practiced motion, he would make an incision. The blood, believed to be the source of the overheating and corruption, would flow, thick and dark, into a ceramic bleeding bowl. The goal was to drain a significant quantity, sometimes until the patient fainted, in the hope that the feverish energy would drain away with it the sight of their own blood. The feeling of lightheadedness sometimes did calm the patient through sheer trauma and shock, if nothing else. But for most, the compulsion returned as soon as the faintness passed, and they would continue their frantic dance, now weakened by blood loss, alongside the lance. The apothecary's shop was the front line of defense. These establishments were Aladdin's caves of the bizarre and the botanical. The air was thick with the dust of dried herbs and the pungent smell of strange chemicals. The apothecary, himself a respected guildsman, would work tirelessly, grinding ingredients with a heavy marble mortar and pestle. His prescriptions were based on the principle of opposites. A hot disease required cooling remedies. So he would prepare poultices of lettuce, endive, and violets, plants believed to have cooling properties, to be applied to the patient's forehead, temples, and the soles of their feet. He would brew bitter teas from these same herbs, a terrible struggle to administer to someone in the throes of a fit. For the pain and hysteria, he might administer a draught of poppy syrup, opium, or nightshade, belladonna, powerful sedatives that could suppress nervous activity but carried a high risk of poisoning espic. In already dehydrated and weakened patients, strong-smelling herbs were crucial, rue, sage, and wormwood were burned in sick rooms. The thick, acrid smoke intended to purify the air of the malign miasmas, the foul vapors thought to carry disease. The patients would lie in these hazy, choking rooms, their bodies still twitching, the scent of burning herbs mixing with the smell of their own sweat, blood, and fear. It was a multisensory assault meant to drive out the imbalance. But medicine was not confined to the learned. For every person who could afford a physician or an apothecary, there were 100 who relied on folk wisdom, a rich and ancient tradition passed down through generations. This was a world alive with invisible forces, and every household had its strategies for bargaining with them, Protective charms became priceless commodities, a hare's foot, carried in a pocket, a bag of certain herbs like St. John's wort worn round the neck, a piece of cold iron, a metal believed to repel evil spirits, placed under the pillow of the afflicted. These were amulets, a kind of spiritual armor against an unseen enemy. Rituals of sympathetic magic were performed in secret. One common belief held that the curse could be transferred. A story circulated of a mother who, seeing her child seized by the dance, took the girl's stocking and placed it on a hot griddle, believing that as the stocking scorched and shriveled, so too would the evil spirit afflicting her daughter. Another tale spoke of a man who buried a bottle containing his wife's urine and clippings of her hair at a crossroads at midnight. A ritual intended to trap the sickness underground at a place of spiritual transition. The line between medicine and magic was so blurred as to be non-existent. An apothecary might legitimately sell unicorn horn, usually narwhal tusk, ground into powder, believed to be a universal antidote to poison and a powerful curative. A physician might advise wearing a dried toad in a pouch round the neck to draw out the fever. The world was not rational. It was symbolic. Every object, every substance, held a potential power that could be harnessed if one only knew the correct ritual. This created a chaotic and often contradictory landscape of treatment. A single dancer might be bled by a physician in the morning, prayed over by a priest at noon, and have a charm of dried toad skin placed under her pillow by her grandmother at night. Each action represented a different worldview, a different answer to the same terrifying question: why? The physician saw a humoral imbalance. The clergy saw sin. The common folk saw malice and magic. All of them, in their own way, were trying to restore order to a world that had suddenly, violently, ceased to make any sense. Their tools were the leech, the lance, and the letus poultice. Their enemy was invisible, misunderstood, and utterly relentless, and in the face of this, their best efforts were not just futile. They were, in the case of the enforced dancing, actively, tragically, murderous. To understand the true impact of the dancing plague, we must first understand the world it shattered. Strasbourg in the early summer of 1518 was not a city waiting for a catastrophe. It was a city simply living. It was a vibrant, noisy, smelly, and fiercely proud free imperial city, a hub of trade and craft on the Rhine. Its rhythms were the ancient, dependable rhythms of daily life, and it is in these rhythms that the horror of the event finds its deepest resonance. Begin with the sounds. Before the pipes, the dominant sound was the bell. The bells of the cathedral marking the canonical hours prime, terce, sext, non-structuring the day for everyone from the bishop to the lowliest beggar. It was the sound of hammers from a dozen different guild halls, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmiths, the softer tapping of the cobblers, the sewing of the carpenters. It was the cacophony of the markets, the cries of the fishwives at the fishmarket announcing a day's catch from the river, the farmers in the corn mark haggling over the price of grain, the cloth merchants boasting of silks from Italy and wool from England. The city was a federation of guilds, and your guild was your identity. You were not just a baker. You were a member of the Bakers' Guild, bound by its rules, protected by its wealth, buried under its crest. The guild halls were more than workshops. They were social clubs, insurance agencies, and political parties rolled into one. In the evenings, the masters would gather in their halls, drinking wine and discussing politics, while the journeymen and apprentices might slip away to one of the countless taverns that dotted the city, places like the Red Ox or the Golden Barrel, where the air was thick with the smell of roasting meat, cheap wine, and the smoke from clay pipes. Inside the tall, narrow, timber-framed houses, life was lived vertically. The ground floor might house a workshop or a shop. The family lived on the floors above, the rooms cramped and dark. Heated by a single central hearth, the air was permanently scented with whatever craft was. Practiced below the tang of tanning leather, the sweetness of baking bread, the pungency of boiling wort from a brewer's household. At night, families would gather for a simple mealer pottage of grains and vegetables. Perhaps a piece of fish or, on a special occasion, some sausage. They would talk, they would gossip, and the gossip was the lifeblood of the city. In a world without newspapers, news travelled through the markets, the taverns, the wells. The topics were timers, the rising price of bread, the scandalous behaviour of the new bishop's nephew, the infidelity of a wealthy merchant's wife, the ominous predictions of an astrologer who had seen a malignant alignment of planets. There was a constant, low hum of anxiety fears of another poor harvest, rumours of the sweating sickness creeping closer from the next town, the general unease that God was perhaps not entirely pleased with his creation. Then there were the festivals, the annual rhythms that offered release from this daily grind, the great celebration of Corpus Christi, with its processions through streets strewn with flowers, the winter carnival before Lent, a time of sanctioned misrule, masking and feasting. These were the times when the city did dance sorely, practiced communal dances that reinforced social bonds and celebrated the divine order. This was the world of Strasbourg, a world of order, hierarchy, and familiar routine. It was not a perfect world. It was fraught with hunger, disease, and inequality, but it was a noble world. Then, Frau Troffea took her first step. The interruption was not instantaneous. It was a slow, creeping poison. At first, it was just a strange story from the Klein Metzgrow, a curiosity. But as the dancing spread, the familiar rhythms of the city began to stutter and fail. The bells still rang, but now they had to compete with the insistent, manic rhythm of the pipers in the cornmarkt. The sound of hammers became sporadic, as craftsmen found themselves distracted, afraid, or called away to care for afflicted family members. The market stalls still operated. But the chatter was different now. The gossip was no longer about merchants' wives or astrological signs. It was only about the dancing. Did you hear? The baker's wife, Anna, seized yesterday right in front of her oven. They say the miller's son saw her and started up himself not an hour later. Just a boy. My husband says we should keep the children indoors. He says it's in the air. You can breathe it in. I heard from a carter that in Aachen, 50 years ago, they had the taverns, once places of boisterous escape, became hushed dens of fearful speculation. The wine tasted the same, but it could not wash away the fear. A man might jump at the sudden clatter of a dropped tankard. His nerves shot. The guild halls still met. But their discussions were no longer about trade or politics. They were about survival. The Tailors' Guild debated whether to pool resources to help afflicted members' families. The Butchers' Guild argued about whether to refuse service to those who lived near the cornmarkt. For fear of contamination, the festival atmosphere of the city inverted itself. The public space now hosted a dance macabre, a horrific parody of the communal dances of Corpus Christi. Where there was once order, there was now chaos. Where there was once practiced rhythm, there was now frantic, uncontrollable spasm. The very concept of public celebration was corrupted. Inside the homes, the change was even more profound. The hearth, the center of domestic life, became a place of vigil. Families would huddle inside, trying to block out the distant music, jumping at every sound from the street. A child's cry, a wife's sudden movement, anything could be the first sign. The home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a fragile box trying to keep the madness out. A side story. lost to the official records, but alive in the realm of what must have been the tale of a young, betrothed couple. The boy, a journeyman carpenter, was to marry the daughter of a master glazier. The wedding was set for a late July. Then the girl's younger brother was struck down. The family, in shame and fear, isolated itself. The wedding was postponed indefinitely. The young carpenter would stand at the end of the street, listening to the terrible music from the center of the city, his future hanging in the balance. A small, personal tragedy swallowed by the larger one. This was the true nature of the plague. It was more than a medical or spiritual crisis. It was a social apocalypse. It broke the bonds of community, turning neighbor against neighbor with the poison of suspicion. It silenced the gossip and replaced it with a single, monotonous topic of terror. It halted commerce, interrupted worship, and corrupted the simple, daily routines that are the bedrock of human society, the world of the guild hall, the market, the tavern, and the family hearth did not end with a bang. It was dismantled, piece by piece, by the sound of a single, relentless pipe melody and the slap of bloody feet on a public stage. The city of Strasbourg, in that summer, became a place its own citizens could no longer recognize a funhouse mere version of itself, where the only thing left to do was to watch and wait, and pray for the music to stop. The events in Strasbourg are often treated as a singular bizarre anomaly, a one-off historical curiosity. What happened in the summer of 1518 was not unique. It was simply one of the most vivid and well-documented examples of a phenomenon that has recurred throughout human history. A phenomenon we now call mass psychogenic illness, or mass hysteria. It is a story written not in the ledgers of city councils, but in the deep, unconscious wiring of the human brain when it is placed under unbearable pressure. To understand Strasbourg, we must listen for its echoes in other times, other places. Let us leave the heat of Alsace for a moment. Let us travel across the ocean and forward in time to a very different place, Salem, Massachusetts, in the winter of 1692. The setting could not be more different. A small, strict Puritan community in the grip of a New England winter, rather than a bustling merchant city in a summer heatwave. But the atmospheric pressure is the same. In Salem, the fear was not of dancing, but of witchcraft. It began, like Strasbourg, with a small group of girls. They suffered fits. They claimed to be pinched and bitten by invisible spectres. They accused others of bewitching them. The response was a mirror image of Strasbourg's. The authorities did not facilitate the fits. They sought to root out their cause, but the underlying psychology was identical. A community living under intense existential stress, the harsh frontier life, religious paranoia, and internal squabbles found its pressure valve in a physical manifestation of fear. The afflicted girls of Salem, like the dancers of Strasbourg, became the focal point for a community's unspoken terrors. Their bodies acted out a script that everyone, on some level, already understood, the script of demonic persecution. The trials and hangings that followed were the equivalent of the Strasbourg stager catastrophic, official response to a crisis of the mind. A desperate attempt to impose a brutal order on a psychic chaos. Now, let us make a much larger leap. To January 30th, 1962, in a girls' boarding school in the village of Kashosha, in what was then Tanganyika, now Tanzania. Here, the manifestation was not dancing or fits, but laughter. It started with 3 girls. They began to laugh. Not a normal laughter, but a compulsive, uncontrollable, hysterical laughing. It was infectious. Soon, dozens of girls were laughing. They couldn't stop. The laughing fits could last for days. They would fall down, writhe, sometimes scream amidst the laughter. The school was forced to close. But the laughter plague spread. It hopscotched to other schools, to other villages, eventually affecting nearly 1,000 people, mostly children and young women, and lasting for months. The Tongonyika laughter epidemic is an almost pure, clinical example of mass psychogenic illness. There was no underlying biological cause. It was a psychological contagion. The trigger is believed to have been the intense pressure of the post-colonial educational system, combined with the anxieties of adolescence. The laughter was a physical release valve for an unbearable, inexpressible stress. It is a direct parallel to Strasbourg, replace the oppressive. Rigid structure of a colonial-era school with the oppressive heat, famine. And religious fear of 16th century Alsace, replace the laughter with dancing, the mechanism either. Same, a group under severe psychological strain subconsciously creates a physical symptom that is both an expression of their distress and, paradoxically, a temporary release from it. We can find quieter, more modern echoes. Consider the myriad fainting epidemics that have occurred in factories, offices, and schools throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. One worker, perhaps feeling faint from the heat or a smell, collapses. Then another, and another, complaining of dizziness, nausea, and shortness of breath. Environmental tests find nothing. The cause is not a toxin in the air, but a virus of fear. In the confined, stressful environment, manifests as fainting. It is a muted, industrial age version of the same primal scream that took the form of dancing in Strasbourg. So, what is the common thread? What are the ingredients for this strange alchemy of the mind? First, and most crucially, a pre-existing state of high anxiety. Strasbourg had famine and disease. Salem had religious extremism and frontier isolation. Tongonyika had cultural and educational pressure. The Martin factory has monotony and a lack of control. The fear must already be there, simmering beneath the surface. Second, a trigger, a specific, startling event that focuses the diffuse anxiety. For Strasbourg, it was the sight of Frau Troffea. For Salem, it was the girl's initial fits. For Tongonyika, it was the first few giggles. The trigger is the spark. Third, a sympathetic audience. The illness spreads through sight and sound among a close-knit group who share the same fears and stresses. It is a language of distress that everyone in the group understands intuitively. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, a symptom that makes sense within the cultural context. In a deeply religious 16th century German city, where the wrath of God and the mischief of saints were daily realities, the body expressed its distress through a dance of death. In a Puritan community obsessed with the devil, the body expressed its distress through demonic possession. In a 1960s boarding school, the expression was laughter. The body speaks its distress in a language the surrounding culture will instantly understand. The Strasbourg Council built a stage because they believed they were dealing with a physical, humoral sickness. The Salem authorities held trials because they believed they were dealing with witches. They were both wrong about the cause. The dancers of Strasbourg were not faking. They were experiencing a very real, very powerful psychosomatic illness. Their feet really bled. Their muscles really tore. Their hearts really gave out. The mind's power over the body is absolute and can be terrifying. It can conjure stigmata, it can induce paralysis, and it can force a person to dance themselves to death. What happened in Strasbourg was not a medieval oddity. It was a human tragedy. It was a stark demonstration of what happens when the weight of the world becomes too heavy for a community to bear, and the mind, in its desperate, creative, and terrifying wisdom, decides to write that pain across the body itself. The pipe music has faded from the Kornmarkt. The laughter in Tongonyika eventually subsided, the witch trials ended, but the potential for such events remains. Because the machinery that creates them is not located in a history book. It is located within us. It is the echo of collective fear, waiting for the right conditions to sound again. The stage in the Kornmarkt was eventually dismantled. Its timbers were likely repurposed, the bloodstains planed away, the wood finding new life as part of a barn or a merchant's stall. The pipers and drummers collected their final wages and slipped back into the obscurity of their guilds. The terrible melodies they were forced to play perhaps haunting their dreams for the rest of their days. The survivors of the plague, those who did not dance themselves to death, recovered slowly, their bodies healing, but their spirits likely forever marked by the memory of those lost weeks when their limb. BS were not their own. The immediate crisis passed. But an event of such profound strangeness and horror does not simply vanish. It refuses to be confined to the pages of a city council ledger. It seeps into the culture's bloodstream. It finds expression in the ways a society processes its deepest fears. The dancing plagues did not end. They transmuted. They became art, folklore, and cautionary tales, their figures forever frozen in the jerking. Desperate poses of a collective nightmare, the most immediate and widespread medium for capturing. The event was the woodcut. In the years and decades following 1518, the nascent printing press fueled a booming industry of sensationalist broadsheets and pamphlets. The Strasbourg dancing plague was a subject tailor-made for this new form of mass media, anonymous. Artists, who may never have set foot in the city, created stock. Powerful images based on second-hand descriptions and their own fertile imaginations. These were not attempts at documentary realism. They were moralistic and terrifying sermons in visual form. The composition was always a chaotic swirl of bodies. A compressed maelstrom of suffering set against a simplified skyline of Strasbourg's distinctive towers. The dancers were depicted not as individuals but as types of anguish. Their faces were grotesque masks, mouths agape in silent screams. Eyes rolled back into their heads to show the whites the universal symbol of possession and madness. Their bodies were contorted into impossible, back-breaking positions. Limbs splayed like broken puppets. The artists took liberties to heighten the drama. In one famous print, the dancers are shown not on a stage but in a wooden pen, like animals, emphasizing their loss of humanity. In another, the hired musicians are depicted as leering demons, their pipes and drums explicitly infernal instruments, making the city's sanctioned cure into a scene of literal hell on earth. The most chilling details were often in the margins, well-dressed, sober citizens, the city fathers. The physicians looked on from the edges of the frame, their hands raised in gestures of futile debate or prayer. This served to implicate the entire society in the event. Sometimes the figure of death himself, a skeletal fiddler, would be seen perched on a rooftop, playing a tune only the dancers could hear. This directly linked the mania to the ever-popular dance macabre motif, reinforcing the idea that this was not just an illness, but a literal dance with death. These broadsheets were sold in market squares across the Holy Roman Empire, their bold black lines and sensationalist captions ensuring the city as shame and wonder were broadcast far and wide. They were not merely reports. They were warnings. They codified the event in the popular imagination as a divine judgment. Beyond the cheap broadsheet, the imagery of the dancing plague seeped into more refined art, though often in more allegorical ways. The work of Peter Bruegel the Elder, born just a few years after the Strasbourg event, is saturated with the spirit of it. His famous paintings, like the fight between Carnival and Lent or the triumph of death, are teeming panoramas of human folly and mortality. While not direct depictions, the chaotic, frenzied energy of the revelers and the victims their distorted movements. Their masks of agony and ecstasy carry the same visceral charge of a society losing its collective mind. Bruegel captures the same fragile boundary between celebration and hysteria, between piety and madness, that the plague had made terrifyingly real. The dancers of Strasbourg had become a type, a symbol for the inherent instability of human civilization. The stories also migrated from printed page to spoken word, evolving into rich local folklore in the villages of Alsace and the Rhineland for generations. Afterward, the events of 1518 were retold, not as history, but as legend. The figure of Frau Troffea was given a backstory. In one common version, she was a lazy and impious wife who, one sweltering Sunday, had refused to go to Mass, declaring she would rather dance. As she uttered the curse, St. Vitus himself struck her down. In another, darker tale, she was a young woman jilted by a lover who sought a witch's help to curse him with a restless heart. The magic backfired, cursing the entire city instead. These stories served a purpose. They provided a simple, moral cause for a senseless tragedy. The plague was no longer an inexplicable event. It was the direct result of an individual sin. A satisfying narrative that offered a lesson and a warning. The story became a tool for social order. Be good, a mother might whisper to a fidgeting child. All the dancing fever will take you, just like it took poor, wicked Frau Troffea. The memory of the plague was thus domesticated, transformed from a citywide trauma into a manageable, moral fable. The most profound and enduring artistic legacy, however, was the reinforcement and literalization of the dance macabre. This allegorical concept, depicting death leading people from all walks of life in a dance to the grave, was a staple of late medieval art. The Strasbourg plague injected this motif with a terrifying new reality. It was no longer just a metaphor. People had actually danced themselves to death. For the people of the Rhineland, the abstract idea now had a specific, shared reference point. The event proved that death didn't just come with a scythe. He could come with a fiddle, and his tune was irresistible. The plague had held a black mirror up to one of humanity's oldest artistic themes and shown that. Its nightmare was, however briefly, real. This cultural processing was a slow seepage, a stain on the canvas of European thought. The dancing plagues became a touchstone for writers and philosophers, a go-to example when discussing mass hysteria, religious fanaticism, or the fragile nature of the human mind. The victims of Strasbourg were forever frozen in their terrible dance, not just in woodcuts and folk tales, but in the very language of human psychology. They became a symbol of the moment when individual consciousness dissolves into the collective unconscious. When reason is overthrown by a compulsion so powerful it can literally move mountains of flesh and bone. The music from the corn-marked stage may have faded into silence in the summer of 1518. But its echo, distorted and amplified by art and story, would reverberate for centuries. A perpetual reminder of the madness that lies just a single, desperate step away. Why does it linger? Why does the story of a strange event in a long-vanished city, 500 years in the past, still hold such a powerful grip on their imagination? We are not a people who believe in hot humors or the curses of saints. We have science, medicine, psychology. We have answers for things. And yet, the dancing plague of 1518 endures. It fascinates us not because it is alien, but because it is not. It feels, in some deep and unsettling way, familiar. It is a dark mirror, And if we look closely into its depths, we can see the faint, flickering reflections of our own world, our own fears, and the strange, vile ways we have of expressing them. Let us step away from the cobblestones of Strasbourg for a moment. Let us consider a modern phenomenon. In the summer of 2016, a mobile game called Pokémon Go was released, almost overnight. Public parks, city squares, and quiet streets were filled with people. They moved in seemingly erratic patterns, their eyes glued to their screens, their bodies responding to prompts and cues invisible to everyone else. They would suddenly dart across a road, cluster around a specific spot, or emit a gasp of triumph. To an outside observer from another time, it might have looked peculiar, a collective, compulsive behavior spreading with viral speed. Focused on an unseen world layered over our own, it was harmless, of course, but the mechanism of its spreader contagion of behavior, leaping from person to person through sight and shared interest, is a benign, digital cousin to the older, darker contagion that seized Strasbourg. This is what we now call social contagion, the spread of behaviors, attitudes, and emotions through a population. We see it in the frantic rush of a financial bubble, where the greed of one investor infects the next. We see it in the panic of a crowd caught in a crisis, where a single scream can trigger a stampede. And we see it, most pervasively, in the digital realm. A viral dance challenge on TikTok, a meme that captivates millions, a wave of online outrage that crests and breaks in a matter of hours. These are the corn-marked stages of our time, vast digital platforms where we perform for each other, our movements, our language, our ideologies spreading in a relentless, often unconscious, mimicry. The medium has changed. The velocity is breathtaking, but the underlying human wiring is ancient. We are a species hardwired for connection and imitation. It is how we learn, how we bond, how we form cultures. But this same wiring has a dark side. Under the right conditions, the same impulse that allows us to share a laugh can allow us to share a panic attack. The same neural pathways that help us learn a useful skill can just as easily lock us into a compulsive, destructive behavior. The people of Strasbourg were not uniquely superstitious or weak-minded. They were simply human beings whose innate capacity for a social connection was hijacked by an atmosphere of unbearable stress. Their internet was the rumour mill of the public well in the town square. Their viral trend was a dance of death. This is where the true, lingering horror of the plague lies for a modern audience. It is not the bloodied feet or the demonic explanations. It is the dawning realization that the line between a shared community and a hysterical mob is terrifyingly thin. That the consciousness we so prize, the individuality we hold as our core, is a fragile vessel. It can be overwhelmed by the collective. The self can be dissolved, not by a potion or a spell, but by the sheer, suffocating pressure of the group's fear. The Strasbourg dancers did not choose to dance. Their bodies were commandeered by a narrative more powerful than their own will. In an age of algorithmic feeds, curated news bubbles, and online echo chambers, this feels less like a medieval curiosity and more like a cautionary tale. How easily are our own thoughts and actions commandeered? How often do we dance to a tune we did not choose, played on a pipe we cannot see? The fascination also stems from a profound, unanswerable mystery, despite all our modern tools. We cannot say with absolute certainty what happened in Strasbourg. We can diagnose it post hoc, with terms like mass psychogenic illness or mass conversion disorder. These are labels, not explanations. They describe the what, not the why. Why that woman? Why that summer? Why that city? Why dancing? The precise alchemy of cause and effect is lost to time. It remains a historical black box. And we need mysteries. In a world that often feels overly explained, sanitized, and mapped, the dancing plague is a reminder that the human psyche is still a vast, uncharted territory. It is a dark forest where reason can still lose its way. We are drawn to it for the same reason we are drawn to stories of shipwrecks or polar explorations. It is a map with a blank space that says, "Here there be monsters." The monster, in this case, is the terrifying potential of our own minds. The plague endures in our art and stories because it is the ultimate metaphor. It is a metaphor for unstoppable obsession, for the idea of being consumed by a passion or a fear so completely that it destroys you. It is a metaphor for a societal breakdown, for the moment when the agreed-upon rules of reality dissolve and something older, wilder, and more primal takes over. Every story about a town consumed by secrets. Every film about a collective madness. Every tale of a curse that makes people act against their will, all of them owe a debt to the strange case of Strasbourg. So, we return to the question, why does it linger? It lingers because it is a ghost story. But the ghost is not in the streets of Strasbourg. The ghost is in our own moral architecture. It is the ghost of our profound sociality, our terrifying suggestibility, our capacity to lose ourselves in the crowd. The heat of that summer has long since dissipated. The specific fears of famine and disease have faded, but the essential human condition, the vulnerability of the individual to the collective, has not changed. When we look at the woodcuts of those tormented figures, we are not just looking at strangers from a distant past. We are looking at a potential, reflection. We are looking at the end of reason. The music from that stage in the Cormark has been silent for half a millennium. But on some frequency, just at the edge of hearing, the tune still plays. It is the sound of a single pipe playing a rhythm that is older than cities, older than history. A rhythm that, given the right conditions, any one of us might still be compelled to dance to. And that was the dancing plague of 1518, a time when people literally danced themselves into history, though not exactly the way they might have hoped. What do you think it was? A curse? Poisoned bread? Or just the strangest group activity Europe ever came up with? Drop your theories in the comments. I promise I won't make you dance for them. And if you enjoyed this strange little detour through the past, give the video a like and subscribe. It helps more curious minds stumble into this corner of history, without the risk of sore feet. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.